Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this session. My name is Alan, and just FYI, and my very social distant colleague, Lotta, is next to me.
Hi there.
She's manning the chat as well. So if any questions pop up that are really relevant for one specific area and that will not be answered afterwards, she'll pass me a post-it and let me know. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Micah, for the nice introduction. I know my mommy would be proud to hear. Otherwise, it always sounds like, oh, that's an interesting profile. So yeah, my background is in engineering, actually, and I've been working in education for the last 15 years in one way or another. So happy to share a bit with you what we're doing. We call this session Empowering Future Changemakers because that's what we always talk about within our job through education. And but most of this session is actually not just about education, but about science. And I'd like to share with you a bit of the work we've done in research and how we're applying that to our corporate customers and learners, actually. I think you've already heard enough about me. We joke about CEO being the chief everything officer, and when you have a small company, that's really what you do. But most interestingly, I'd like to introduce you to my partner who's not here today, Professor Stefano Brusoni. And Stefano and I have been working together for the last 8 years. He's a professor at ETH Zurich, the Swiss Technical Institute of Technology. And a lot of the stuff I'm presenting today is based on his research. And I think that's what's interesting about what we do. We're building on some of the research between innovation, management, and neuroscience that Stefano has been doing for the last 10, 15 years. So just a little overview of what we will talk today. First off, a little setting of the environment we're in a couple of slides. Then what do we do at Sparkademy? What's our kind of, how do we differentiate ourselves, or what we believe that makes us different? And then we're going to pinpoint one of these differentiators and go into kind of the science behind and what's the research that's been done at ETH Zurich and what we've done with that, and give you a short overview of one case, one practical example of how this was used within a corporate setting. I hope you find it interesting and happy to share with you. So the opportunity, as I see it, because I remember someone told me that when I started my MBA, it's like, we should always frame the word problem as an opportunity space. And really, I think that's part of this growth mindset Micah was talking about. What is that opportunity? Well, I think it's clear to all of us. Yes, the world is changing, and we're even more aware of that right now as we were before. But I think that some interesting numbers that we start seeing pop up is, first of all, the top 5 companies in the world basically were not there 10 years ago. And half the Fortune 500 companies actually have disappeared in the last few years. And that churn of basically these giants of research, of industry, of jobs are coming and going. And at the rate of where we're going right now, we feel that this trend is accelerating. There's a recent report by IBM talking about how kind of we have these enormous skill gap that is growing. We have a lot of talent, but it's not being positioned, it's not being placed, it's not being aligned with each other and towards the new way of working and the new challenges we have. Of course, always need to mention COVID these days, but this has actually kind of been a catalyst of change for many things. I think we were all always joking about who was the chief digital officer or that made the change, or was it COVID? And COVID is also kind of painting a lot of very, very clear pictures of the problems we have today with skills. Leadership, for example, is something that very, very clearly stood out as, are leaders really being leaders, or are they just being kind of, drill masters? And how is that leadership being perceived, and how is that helping teams move forward? So in this context is that kind of we're working on very specifically towards these skills that we're looking to work on. We always talk about this digital world that we live in, and However, the skills that we're lacking are generally not about coding, but actually like things around it. The things that make us human are actually more important than they've ever been, because they're the one that differentiate us from this automation that's going over. So we're always talking about creativity, customer centricity, kind of creating culture of change. So, I mean, the World Economic Forum talks about, the top skills for employers, and this is already a couple years to go. Of course, the World Economic Forum publishes a lot of different things too. We always take these things with a grain of salt. But for all of us who are working in the corporate world, we see these things popping up, number one. At the top level, we're also seeing the need for them as we go along. So how are we tackling these challenges? Our approach to this upskilling challenge is a little different from what you usually see out there. Number one, we strongly believe, and based on research, we've found that learning is best done, number one, in groups. People learn very, very well when they're actually part of a cohort, part of a team, kind of a class. What you learn from your colleague is often kind of as important sometimes as what you learn from the professor in front of you. Number two, for all these different types of the skills we're working on, you actually need to practice them. It's great to read about them. It's great for someone to tell you. It's great to see the examples, but it's not until you actually do them that you start actually developing this understanding of them. And we think that by doing this, we're helping actually develop these future leaders. Now, of course, we're doing this digitally, which becomes a challenge when you're teaching, which is often known as, and I'm using air quotes here, soft skills. We call them behavioral skills. And it's easy to see when you're learning, Java online, if something compiles or it doesn't, you automatically get feedback. But how do I get feedback online at scale on my interview skills? How I get feedback on how I lead a team online? So that's kind of where the challenges start and why our approach is a little different. I'm going to mention 4 things that make our approach different, and then I'm going to zoom in on one. First of all, we very carefully select the people that go through our program. And this is mainly largely built on Stefano's work, and this is what we're going to go into a bit deeper later. But we strongly believe that by identifying these change makers and empowering them, we're already halfway through through the journey. So we spend a lot of time and effort actually trying to check who are the most suited candidates for this job. And that actually changes over time, but we'll go through this in a second. The second thing is we keep the participants engaged from beginning to end of our program at a very, very kind of high level. High level, I mean like very highly engaged. I don't know if you're aware, but actually like online learning engagement in the corporate world is somewhere between 8 and 14%. So basically only, let's say less than 10% of the people in a corporate that have access to online learning are actually actively using it. This is, the equivalent of giving someone a library card. It's great, but do you go there? Do you not go there? What are you actually learning? So we put a lot of effort into basically trying to, through different social mechanisms, to get people to keep a high level of engagement. Third, we really try to take the learning that they have and help them apply it to what they're doing. So through different types of exercises, different types of peer-to-peer learning, different types of kits and methods, we actually try to get them to take their learning into work environment, into the business. And we've all gone through these, I've been teaching design thinking for 10 years, design thinking workshop, all is wonderful, 2 days, woohoo, we had a great time. And then I come back to the office, I sit at my desk and I open my email and off I go down to the usual rabbit hole of work. So then how do I take this wonderful 2 days, 1 week, whatever I did, and then bring it back to, so we're working on bridging that gap. And finally, well, this is the digital world. We are tracking, assessing, and really certifying every single little step of the way of that learning process. And we do this, number one, by having very, very carefully designed, engineered even learning content in different formats and actually assessing as we go along. In doing this, we're, number one, putting extra effort in making sure that our content is not just, a cool YouTube video of someone giving a cool chat, but it was actually designed for learning. And then we assess at a, let's like I call it a micro level, different aspects of that learning journey in different ways. So we can really see where students got lost, what they understood, and we can do A/B testing with different types of content to see what's more effective, etc. So we can start tailoring as we go along. So as you can see, the road to transformation is actually kind of long and windy. This is not really kind of a straightforward process. Someone asked, what does cohort mean? Good question. Thank you very much for asking. Cohort means a group of people. A cohort is, we take groups of participants from different departments, different areas, and put them into from the same company and put them into the program together. So that's a cohort in English. So transformation is not necessarily kind of a straightforward process. And whoever's selling corporate transformation in a 100-slide deck and a 6-month process is actually not very straightforward. Now the question is, how do we get ourselves through this process? And the way we do it, we started with the research, with the science. We've developed what we call the Spark check to identify these change makers. We design education in a way that is kind of effective learning, and then we can check if they can apply it. And we believe that through this, we start reaching transformation. A graphic I like very much because it reminds me of the adopter curve for a product is how do we get this transformation to happen in a company? In every single organization, big, large, NGO, World Food Bank or 3M, you'll always have a group of people who are super, super highly motivated and super energetic and super they're really into this. Then you'll have a group of people who think this is interesting. You'll have a group of people who think like, oh, maybe. And then you'll have a group of people who say, screw it, I'm never going to do this. I'm really happy with how things are. This is the kind of normal facts of life. Question is, if we can identify these really, really motivated people and empower them, will that help start doing the work to get then the early majority to adopt things? Because at the end of the day, the best people to have this process go forward are the same people in the organization. They understand the lingo, they understand the culture, they understand the place, they understand what they're doing. So this is kind of our view on how we create this transformation process. Just a short introduction to kind of what we're doing at Sparkademy and deep dive into a lot of different things, but I would like to really focus right now on the selection process. It's identifying these change makers. And I'll give you some examples of the research work that Stefan has been doing. So the science. I remember, first week as an innovation manager at a large corporate, there was this sign when I came in the door that said, everyone is an innovator. We all have to innovate. Innovation is everybody's job. I remember that very, very clear because I was actually in our slide deck from the innovation department. Innovation is everybody's job. In my mind, I'm like, yeah, sure. And we do live in a knowledge workers. We are knowledge workers, right? So we are actually all adopting new ways. We're all learning as we go along. We're all improving. Everybody has to do things better as we go along. However, does that really mean that everyone is, by definition, an innovator? Long story short, the answer is no. They're not, and I'll show you why. But the more interesting part actually is that actually they could be. So are we all innovators? No, we're not. But we all could be innovators. And I think that's where the science part gets a bit interesting. In order to give you a little more insight into this, I'd like to introduce you to the Technology and Innovation Management Chair at ETH Zurich. And it's basically their work, which I'm very, very badly introducing to you and explaining to you in hopefully a bit more of an understanding and less academic way. But it's the research, and Stefan is right down here in the picture, but that's his team. And this group is doing a lot of work into innovation, management, and different ways of applying kind of these changes. What exactly do they work on, and why we're associated with them very strongly is, as I mentioned, innovation, but also decision-making. And we'll see further along that a lot of the bigger issue usually with innovation is not the idea or the thing itself that we're doing, but but actually the decisions needed to be taken in order to effectuate that change. Someone needs to make a bloody decision. And I can tell you, I live in Switzerland, and we're always driven by consensus, but sometimes that makes decision making really, 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 really slow. And it makes it harder to actually kind of gather actual evidence through prototyping and testing. At TIM, they do a lot of different types of research, but mainly lab studies, and they go in depth into kind of how do they take a certain situation, they put it in a lab setting, and they analyze it very differently. Why they're doing this? Because they think this has a huge impact on actually education. And that's why this is ETH Zurich, and Stefano is actually, like his main raison d'etre, we would say, is education. He's very, very passionate about students, and a lot of the work we do at ETH is working with the students. So this is, you're seeing the corporate side of things, but we do a lot of work with students at ETH. Now, go back to our question. What is an innovator, and what's the, let's say, what defines a good innovator? And it's not a straightforward answer, of course. And we think about it as an iceberg. You have what looks like an innovator, but we never see the things that happen behind. It's also as a successful entrepreneur, right? We just see the success. We never see all the hard work that went behind the scenes. There's a lot of different aspects of an innovator that Stefan and his team have been looking into. They've analyzed these things in a very, very interesting way, and I'll go a little bit deeper into that. But if I were to summarize this a bit further, I would build on Amabile's work, which fascinating lady, and this is from the 80s, which looks at innovation and creativity into three different specific, let's say, boxes. The first one, and actually, and you'll remember I mentioned motivation at the beginning as one of the four things that we're working at Sparkademy. You actually need people to want to do it. And let's say, if they don't want to, you can forget about it. The question is, can you get them to want or not? That's a different story, but you need to have a key motivation factor. On the other end of the spectrum, there is the expertise. Like say, they need to know a bit. I can't innovate in biology. I don't know anything about biology. I can facilitate the process of a bunch of biologists working differently or finding innovation, but I need to have some subject matter experts no matter what. Now, again, we work in a corporate world, so we assume that anybody who works at a company should know something about that expertise. So we let's take that as a given. Not always, but let's take it as a given. And then we have the cognitive and personality traits. And this is really kind of what we're focusing on. When it comes to cognitive like personality traits, we split these things into three different buckets, which they're looking into. And we're not going to go into depth into all of these. I just wanted to give you kind of a high level view. We have attention control, which we're going to look into a little bit deeper now. Then we have a temperament character, and this is something that's kind of, that's who we are. This is not something that will change, and there's a spectrum into that temperament and character that actually we move on, which helps innovation or hinders innovativeness. Let's put it that way. Temporal perspective is also interesting. I kept this in here because I like this example of, we all know a person who loves talking about the past, the good old days. Actually, the phrase, the good old days, is like my number one explanation for the temporal perspective. Some of us are naturally more prone to think about how life was before. Others of us are very much on the now. It's like we really focus on what's going on now. And some of us are really, really about kind of way out there in the future, like the Elon Musks of the world. They're living in a different dimension. That's part of a kind of a brain composition, actually, that really, really defines how, let's say, likely we are to be open to a certain new idea or something that's a little bit different. Again, so I just wanted to mention that because that's actually something kind of in our brain that's quite fascinating, but won't go into detail of that at the moment. So at ETH, and then this is kind of a second to last slide on the work that Stefano does, they're basically going into depth of every single one of these boxes. And through different studies, different mechanisms, different lab studies, they're trying to understand how people function within these different aspects. Of course, this is a very, sanitized version. It's like a hospital setting. You put people in a room with a perfect temperature, no interruptions, and you have them do certain tests. But what's interesting of the work Stefano's done, and he's spent kind of decades working on this, we've managed to take this from this artificial university setting to business. One small example of that, and this doesn't tell you much, to be honest, but one of our corporate clients, the first one actually, we analyzed a group of people ourselves, let's say as consultants. We talked to them, we interviewed them, and we ranked how innovative they were in different aspects based on our interview and working with them. We had their employer rank them in certain aspects of innovativeness based on their work performance and how they were doing at the company. And then we had them all go through a long series of very sanitized, let's say, Stefano tests. I'll call them Stefano tests for now. Let's say in the lab. This was a really like heavy experiment, even if it was only 30 people. Interestingly, we realized that we had 15 specific variables within all of Stefano's work that were highly relevant to matching to basically how the firm assesses them and how we assess them separately. So again, it's just trying to take this lab setting towards practice. And this is kind of the type of experiments we've been running for the last, I don't know, 5-6 years already, to try to bridge from science to practice. I'm going to stop right there with let's say the generic Stefano side, and I'm going to focus right now on the ambidexterity part of the thing of the story, because I think that's really interesting in the environment we're talking about right now. Most of you have heard of Alexander Osterwalder. He talks about this exploration balancing between companies that are really good at doing what they're doing better and companies that are looking at new horizons. And this is really kind of where we're going to go a little bit deeper and give you a little bit more examples of how we're using that. So we take this exploration dilemma and we split it up into what we call convergent and divergent thinking. Think about the individual right now, okay? As a person, I have certain strengths in using logic in order to find an answer. And as an individual, I also have certain strength in actually looking for connecting the dots into exploring new possibilities. Okay, these are different parts of the brain. So we've usually seen this nice picture with two sides of the brain, and then there are specifically two different parts of the brain that actually work on these two sides: the exploration and exploitation side. Just to, again, a bit more detail, we don't have to go into these the details of the what parts of the brain focus on what. But what helps us with the convergent part of the exploitation is basically the parts of the brain that are related to rewards, that we know that it's actually we're going to get something back the same. Persistence, so we actually kind of keep ourselves kind of how persistent we are sometimes is related to this kind of exploitation side of the story. And memory, actually our memory is very strongly related to pulling from what we know, pulling from our experience, and actually getting that to help us make a conclusion. On the divergent side of the story, it becomes a little more emotional, actually. Here is a lot about kind of figuring out where we are in placing the problem within a context that we understand or we don't, and trying to connect these things. And then how does this make us feel towards a potential next option? I'll go a bit more into detail into this. So one of the tests that Stefano did actually was putting 54 what he called expert decision makers. This was a combination of R&D managers at the top engineering firms and successful, and highlight on the successful, multi-million-dollar business tech entrepreneurs. And what he did is he put the sample of people into fMRI machines, and while they were in there, he had them do a test that's called the gambling task, which essentially is these little 4 boxes, and you need to make certain decisions in order to get a higher payoff. It's called gambling because basically it's like, we call it like slot machine. So every single box will give you a certain reward, and then your goal is to maximize that reward. And you need to choose between these 4 little, let's say, boxes, to get that. And it's the microseconds that go between you having to make a choice and making that choice where the brain lights up like a Christmas tree. Very, very interesting work. He separated these two kind of, if you look at the convergent, divergent side of the story, and managers and entrepreneurs. In short, and again, there's a lot of interesting work, I'm sending you the literature, but in short, as expected, as you might expect, managers are slightly better at convergent thinking, actually. So slightly better at actually kind of this exploiting side of the story. However, entrepreneurs are clearly strongly better at the divergent side of the story. However, it's not that they diverge more. It's not that they're like constantly exploring. It's that they actually are better at understanding when to diverge. Okay, that's an important part of here. It's not always going out exploring. It's about knowing when to explore. Another thing that's important here is that the context matters. And we realized that with people who had gone from being top managers to being entrepreneurs and vice versa, neither of these things are built in or driven by genetics, actually. This is entirely an outcome of the environment that we're in, actually. So if we work in the corporate world and then we put ourselves in a startup and survive there, actually, we're more likely to develop kind of a certain strength. Why? Because the most fascinating part of this particular part of the story is that all these parts that are associated with convergent and divergent are in neuroplastic parts of the brain. So we can train them, we can get better at it if we're in the right context and we practice, we exercise them. So we're all basically prone to be very fit, whether we choose to go to the gym or not. That's in my personal case, not very much, other people more. But I think that's what makes this interesting is, okay, we can actually be better at this. I mentioned earlier a bit about the emotional side of the story and how basically emotions are important here. So I'd like to give very, very simple definitions. Number one, exploration, because we were looking at the divergent thinking, exploration is basically switching from one alternative to the other. This is how we define it in this very, very simple case. Now, when we switch, before we switch, we form an attachment with certain option. Okay, switching basically means I was doing this and now I have to do something else. No matter how long we've been doing whatever we were doing, we get attached to it because we feel a certain comfort there. Now, I think then it's the knowledge about the distance between how far away the new switch feels versus not. So if I'm used to very, very often doing X and option Y is super, super, super different, then there's a longer distance between these two things. The longer I stick to one thing, the harder it is to switch because the distance becomes longer. The interesting part is that these aspects actually create certain emotional reactions in people. And again, I think I see half of you guys have actually run innovation teams and workshops, and you'll realize some of these aspects from your participants. Number one, the microsecond between us switching to an alternative, that's what lights up in the brain is what's associated with us disliking something. We do not like to change. None of us. That's human nature. How much we dislike it is a different story, but none of us like changing, okay? And in the moment we change, brain lights up. Number two, the more we form an attachment with a certain option, that generates anxiety. So switching from something we've been attached, so again, looking backwards, where we create a habit. So that's why breaking habits is so hard, because it starts creating anxiety the moment we want to switch. And then finally, looking again forward, how far away the new option looks like. If I'm used to always riding a bicycle, and now I have to ride a motorcycle, it feels like, oh, this is kind of, it feels maybe too far away, or in a Formula One car. Then that creates fear. Again, lights up the part of the brain which is associated with us being scared. Just to give you kind of a little bit more context here, how do we define anxiety and fear? This is, Stefan always laughs about this example, but so anxiety is there might be a tiger. Fear is there's a freaking tiger right there. So these are two different kind of parts of the brain. But if I go back to this slide, it's fascinating that basically people's reaction to change is actually say, in the brain, the same as being unhappy or being unhappy, disliking, being actually afraid. People are literally afraid to change. So now when we take a group of random people from the corporate, we sit them down there and we tell them, think about a far, far away future and come up with ideas, their brain is lighting up like a Christmas tree. That is not very effective use of their time, or we need to ease them into it, okay? So what? And why is this important? And how am I with time? Mike, I'm good? Yeah.
Yeah, we have half an hour now, so...
Cool. And I hope you find this interesting so far. So the emotions are important, and we cannot, they're strong and we cannot ignore them. The emotional side of the story is important. Interesting also, if you think about this, the implications of this to entrepreneurship, which actually it's ongoing research. We haven't published that, but I think it's very interesting that people who are more innovative and entrepreneurial and not. But emotion is also associated with curiosity and looking about different options. What this boils down to in the end is that if we want to train people in innovative related things, we need to think about both the cognitive side of the story, meaning kind of the memory and how they can connect the dots, etc., but also their emotional reaction towards it. If we ignore, as we often do, the emotional side of the emotional intelligence side of things, we're very, very likely to fail. So that's why we focus on approaching it in these two different ways. And this is basically what we've translated from this kind of very academic scientific work towards our selection tool or our identification tool at Sparkademy, which we call the Spark Check. What exactly is the Spark Check? If I take those 15 variables that I mentioned that Stefano thought were interesting, and then I boil it down to the ones that help me identify, not the ones that tell me why, and that we focus specifically on the cognitive and the emotional side of the story, we came up with a 45-minute to an hour, basically online test. So we don't put people in fMRI machines. So I've actually had people ask me that all the time, which allows us to basically identify where in the spectrum of innovativeness, and I'm using air quotes again, do these people stand? Why? Because we want to find the ones that are the more likely, because they're probably the least fearful, the least anxious, and therefore the more likely to kind of get the change running. So we look at these two different things, ambidexterity, understanding human needs. We superimpose always this innovation Venn diagram because, again, if we think about understanding human needs, we look at the desirability side of the story. And the ambidexterity means that I'm basically switching from one bubble to the next and the ability to switch. So that's why we connected to that. In this case, not entirely relevant. But let's look at the ambidexterity part, this exploration, exploitation. As I mentioned, there's this gambling task that's been used already for, 20 years. We've adapted that into a more user-friendly online version, which looks something like that. And we're always kind of joking about, it looks like the Microsoft logo. But essentially, this allows us to place people within kind of how comfortable are they dealing with uncertainty. And we place them between being very task-oriented or more towards people-oriented. So we try to kind of place them in a map, say, okay, where do you stand kind of within these kind of decision-making skills and kind of switching. Based on that, we give them very, very specific feedback on how they can, where they are and how can they improve, how can they work on it, everything from articles, books, apps, etc. The second part is more closer to emotional intelligence and how good are they actually at understanding, not themselves. Again, here it's not about how I feel, but understanding kind of third party and how they are perceiving certain things. So we split it into two parts. Again, emotional intelligence is huge. There's different angles to it, but we focus specifically on two things. Can they identify emotions in other people? And can they basically connect the dots between cause and effect? Okay. This we do through things like this. And it's like, okay, how does this person feel? Giving them scenarios. What would this person feel based on this certain scenario? And then this allows us to basically place them again within the emotional intelligence side of the story. Where are them in the spectrum and how can they improve? How can they get better? So you might wonder, does this work? And again, this is...
I'm just connecting the dots of the minutes.
Yeah.
I would shortly move to questions and answers, so we don't lose all the questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go on.
Absolutely. But yeah, the short answer, it does work. We've tested it. We find strong correlation between the test and how people do in different types of trainings, and how good they are at going through that training and applying it later on. So I think that's a pretty kind of interesting output. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Happy to share with you the slides later on. This is a link to a mini version of the Spark check. If you want to play with it, you're more than welcome to. It's kind of a short version of the existing Spark check.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. This is really interesting. Science, to use science to understand our brain and how we work, and especially all the behavior that is unconscious. I think we could talk hours about it, or at least I could listen hours to you talking about it. First of all, I would like to thank everybody in the audience to tell us where you're from. We have people from Canada, the US, Brazil, Switzerland, France, India, Cyprus, Germany. This is great. We have the whole world. And I would actually like to connect the first question I saw in the chat to that. And please go on to add more questions in the chat, or tell me that you would like to speak up. Turn on your video so we can have it as interactive as possible. But there was one comment rather by Jiri saying there is a big difference between the US and Europe and maybe other parts of the of the world. Is the research and the science, are people different in different regions of the world?
I would say Americans have more courage than Europeans. They are more tolerant to risk and more tolerant to failure. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons between Europe and the United States, not the research and development, but the courage to start something new. You know, we have to check, we have in English with two terms, business and entrepreneurship. We translate it into Czech by the same word, but it's something quite different.
You're absolutely right, completely right. And I mentioned earlier, it's what matters, the context matters a lot. Again, if you take a kind of a Swiss person and you place them in Silicon Valley, the likelihood of them, the context matters, and that's but making that change of context, by the way, it also creates dislike and fear and anxiety, because that in and of itself is a decision and it's a change. But the context matters strongly. Now the question is how let's say, do we survive in that context long enough to get that change, or do we feel too fearful, too unhappy, and then we move back to our kind of comfort zone? So, but yes, the context matters strongly.
They take change as an opportunity, while in Europe, we take change as a risk. Yeah, that's a problem.
And I would like to add to that question, because Jerry is working at teaching students at university. So this brings me to another question. Actually, if, for example, there's more courage in the US, is this because of education? And when did this happen? Is this actually, because now we're talking about corporate education, is there should we work on this during university education, or do we already need to teach this at schools, or is it already toddlers and it's a parent's responsibility?
No. As I mentioned, it's about creating the spaces. We talk about in design thinking, we talk about the safe space. So in an environment, and that environment needs to be social, physical, and emotional, where the individual feels more comfortable to do certain things, and that matters. And you see people that when they're working in one context, they behave a certain way, and they work in another, and they take certain. We can do that in education. We do it. I mean, you have places like the D School at Stanford, you have HBS, and this creates these bubbles, so to say, where people are more prone. That's why, these kind of funny looking places your brain registers in a different way. Now, if you train these people on being X format, but you do not give them the actual space, and space, I mean like actually the time, giving the resources, the environment to work this way, then again, you're not really they're not going to absorb that in a certain way. So from an education perspective, we at ETH Zurich, we call Spark Labs, and you go into that classroom and it doesn't look like a classroom. It looks weird, it looks different. But already the students come in and they're not looking at these,
We often get a feedback from the companies that our students are not well prepared for them. That's one thing. Another, we often hear from the students, we always teach us how to do it, but we would like to know how it is really done. And academicians can hardly say it to them without any external practice. Yeah, typical academician is interested in writing articles and things like that, but without much experience in a company. I came to the university from the company, and I was surprised that the process is quite common in the industry, are not established at the university. Who teaches it? Yeah.
No. And I have another question that is related to this, and it's a question coming from Parinita, who asks, is there a way to transform less likely innovators to move into the bracket of highly likely innovators, considering they could be innovators?
The key message here is, again, we're not all by definition innovators, but we all could be. And now, if you think about this little graphic where I show the adoption curve, essentially what we're doing is we're taking the people who, for personal reasons, for very other different contextual reasons, are more likely to be innovators, and we give them the tools, we give them the space, we give them the environment, we give them the language, we allow them to be more innovative. As they're doing that, they're creating a bigger innovative space within that organization, which allows the people who are, a little bit further out of that bubble to feel a bit more comfortable, to see it, to experience it, to be able to to see real examples coming out of that. So it's a process of transformation. And of course, culture doesn't change from one day to the next. But if you're in an organization where it started very small, but it started growing, that means the context in which you're sitting, no matter if you were the innovator or not, is changing, which allows you to, if you're a little bit lower, closer in the spectrum to the less fear, less anxiety, et cetera, then you're more likely to say, I want to try that too. So we don't see it as like, okay, innovators, not innovators, we're not dealing with them.
So how would you, because I've been in discussions where it was about, should we rather take the people that are really motivated to turn into innovators and put them onto these challenges and initiatives? Or should we rather select the people that have the best starting conditions? And I've even seen tests where people answer 100 questions and then it's actually not the people, but somebody else deciding you are the best to go to innovators. Is there science to actually select the best people, or would you say motivation to change and learn is even more important?
Well, you remember the three things. Motivation is number one. You might be very, very prone to innovation, but you're in a place where you hate your job, you hate the company, and you want them all to go screw themselves. No matter how good you are at innovation, you just do not have the motivation to actually do it there. So in that case, I would say, this person might become the next Elon Musk outside, but he or she just is not very happy there. So motivation is key. No motivation, no party. The people need to want to do this. And I think that happens a lot again in the corporate context where, okay, we're training someone. You, Bobby, over there in the corner who, we're not going to miss. You go over. Sandra, don't touch Sandra. Sandra does, 80% of the job for the team. So she might be super motivated, but they're not going to let her go because she's too valuable in the team, right? But the other guy sitting. So we end up with basically appointed people who are not really there because they want to be there, just because their boss sent them. I think that's the worst thing that can happen for the innovation process. I'm here because my boss sent me. I think most
Yes,
of us
and
who work there.
this actually relates to a different topic of maybe more listening to the people in the company and what motivates them. I mean, you spoke about emotions today, and on another occasion, I heard you say that human well-being and even hugs at work drive the ability to innovate. So it's actually also very, very important to listen to the people and integrate their personal maybe motivations and how they feel about it. And this leads me to the next question. There is this drive today to let emotions more and more out, even in the work context. But many of us fear letting especially personal emotions out at work. Can this be educated?
Yeah, but that's a harder topic. Remember when we talked about emotional intelligence, I said emotional intelligence is large, and we're just focusing on, again, if you think of emotional intelligence 101 is basically, do you understand yourself? And can you, do you love yourself, or do you understand yourself? That's a whole other, that's what we're doing is easy peasy stuff compared to that. And that's why we're not even touching it. I just want to understand if, okay, Parintia, is she uncomfortable with the way I'm expressing myself? Is she happy? So we're focusing on how I perceive from the others and how I analyze that. If we look at to motivation, if we were to connect motivation with their own way of being able to express it, yeah, but that's
okay.
Hard.
I understand. We have to start with the basics. We have to start with the basics. So that would rather be something when you really
Pro
get
level. Yeah.
perfect at a later stage. I have another question here by Stephen. How rigid is the cohort process? Is it possible for individuals to participate if there is not a situation of enough to make up a full cohort for the same company?
In our program, it's always cohort based, because I put it this way: we have very good content. We have some of world leading professors giving certain content, but in my mind, content is cheap. Honestly, go online, you'll find a lot of really, really good content. The question is the curation process, and then how do you apply it? So curation will take you a while, but in that case, we would save you some time by looking at our content. But then the application part, if you're just by yourself and looking at it, how much are you actually going to put it into practice? So that's why the cohort for many, and also for other like motivation factors, et cetera, it's really, really important. When we have an individual kind of take over this and not be, let's say, surrounded by others, the likelihood of this person finishing is the same as the 14% I mentioned at Coursera.
Okay.
So that's why we always keep the cohort. Now, if a company is not committed enough to send us a cohort of people, this company is definitely not even imagining having the safe innovation space that we're talking about. So our customers are committed to this type to innovation. So therefore, again, if you look at it into the context, that context matters, because if the company is not willing to give them that space to do this and have a cohort of people go through this, then they might be doing it for other stuff. It doesn't just have to be with us. But if the company itself is not invested in it, then the likelihood of you having the right context for it diminishes, and therefore the likelihood of you being able to do something diminishes, and therefore.
Yes. Thank you very much, Alan. I could listen to you for at least 1 more hour. Thank you very much. I found this very inspiring. So you sparked a lot of new ideas in my head, and for everybody in the room, even if I can't see all of you, I hope it was the same. I see there are more questions in the chat. What we're going to do is we'll continue this discussion on the online platform. There is the Innov8rs online platform, and I'll post all the open questions on the platform, so you can even ask more questions, add your comments, and we can continue the exchange over there. I see also that Ali posted Epi posted a link for the next session. So thank you very much, Alan, for enlightening, for educating us today. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. See you soon. See you the next time, and see you in the Q&A on the platform.
Thank you very much, everybody.